On a crisp, biting morning in the early spring of 1965, the suburbs of White Bear Lake, Minnesota, looked exactly like the dream the post-war era had promised. The snow was beginning to recede, leaving behind that distinct, metallic scent of wet pavement and dormant grass. And the houses stood in neat, polite rows, split levels and ranches where the curtains were always drawn just so. In one of those houses on Hoffman Road, a 3-year-old boy named Dennis was living a nightmare that the neighborhood refused to see. He was a beautiful child, with a shock of light hair and wide, searching eyes that seemed to constantly look for an exit or a reason for the pain. But on that Easter Sunday, the searching stopped. To understand how a toddler could be beaten to death in a quiet neighborhood without a single neighbor raising an alarm, you have to understand the players in this tragedy, beginning with a young woman named Sherwood. In 1961, Jerry was 17, spirited and sharp-edged, but living in a world that had no place for a girl in her condition. She was pregnant, unmarried, and sent away to a home for unwed mothers in Minneapolis. She was a girl with everything ahead of her but no agency over her own body or the life growing inside her. When she gave birth to a healthy 6-pound boy she named Dennis, the state told her it was for the best that he find a proper home. Jerry was a fighter, even then. But you can't fight a system that treats your child like a clerical error. She signed the papers with a shaking hand, a ghost of a promise in her heart that she would find him again when the world was different. Enter Lois Jurgens. If Jerry was the fire, Lois was the frost. Lois was a woman of meticulous, terrifying order. She was in her late 30s, often seen with her hair set in rigid, immovable waves, wearing floral house dresses that looked ironed to the point of structural integrity. She and her husband, Harold, a man who worked hard, kept his head down, and seemed to exist primarily as a shadow in his own home, had struggled to conceive. They wanted a family, or rather Lois wanted a project. She wanted a child who would reflect her own perceived perfection back at the world. When they adopted Dennis, the social workers saw a stable, religious, middle-class couple. They didn't see the hairline cracks in Lois's psyche, or the way her discipline was actually a simmering, volcanic rage, looking for a soft place to land. By 1963, the house on Hoffman Road had become a silent fortress. Dennis wasn't just a toddler. To Lois, he was an affront. He was a messy, loud, unpredictable variable in her controlled environment. The abuse began small slaps for a spilled drink, pinches for a slow response, but it escalated with a sickening, rhythmic intensity. Neighbors later recalled seeing the little boy through windows, standing in corners for hours, or hearing the muffled, rhythmic thud of something hitting a wall. But this was 1964 Minnesota. You didn't meddle. You didn't ask why the Jurgens boy always had a new bruise on his forehead, or why he seemed to shrink whenever Lois entered a room. The final descent began on that Easter morning in 1965, while the rest of the town was preparing for church, putting on their Sunday best and hiding plastic eggs in the budding gardens. Lois Jurgens was in a frenzy. Something had snapped. Dennis had reportedly soiled himself, a cardinal sin in the church of Lois. She didn't just punish him. She dismantled him. She struck him with such force that his small, fragile bowel ruptured. For hours, as the sun climbed higher over the lake, Dennis lay in his bed, dying of peritonitis, a slow, agonizing poisoning of the system. Harold was there. He heard the cries. He saw the child fading. But Harold's fear of his wife was greater than his love for his son. By the time they called the doctor, it was far too late. The local coroner in 1965 looked at the body of Dennis Jurgens and saw a map of horror. There were more than 50 bruises. There were marks that looked suspiciously like cigarette burns. There was a tear in the tissue of his private parts. The doctor knew this wasn't a fall down the stairs. He told the police as much. But in a move that still baffles the conscience, the investigation stalled. The Jurgens were good people. They were grieving parents. The death was ruled a tragic accident, a fall from a bed or a staircase, and Dennis was buried in a small, lonely plot. His story seemingly ended before it had even begun. The years rolled by like the heavy Minnesota winters. Jerry Sherwood grew up. She married, had more children, and built a life. But the hole in her heart where Dennis belonged never closed. By 1980, the world had changed. The silence of the 60s was being replaced by the activism of the 80s. Jerry, now a woman in her late 30s with a fierce maternal gravity, decided it was time. She didn't want to interfere. She just wanted to know he was okay. She wanted to see the man he had become. The moment of impact happened in a small beige social services office in St. Paul. Jerry sat across from a caseworker who held a thin, yellowing file. She asked for Dennis. The caseworker looked down, a flicker of pity crossing her face, and said the words that would ignite a 20-year-old fire. "I'm sorry, Jerry. Dennis died in 1965. The grief was an instant, crushing weight, but right behind it was the suspicion. Children didn't just die in good homes." Jerry went to the library, pulling old microfiche records of the White Bear Lake Press until her eyes ached. She found the tiny obituary. She found the accident report. And then she found the original autopsy photos. When Jerry saw the images of her son, black and blue skeletal, his face a mask of terror even in death, she transformed from a searching mother into an avenging angel. She began knocking on doors in White Bear Lake. She found the old neighbors who were now elderly, their consciences heavy with 2 decades of silence. One by one, they began to talk. They talked about the screaming. They talked about seeing Dennis forced to eat his own vomit. They talked about the day they saw Lois shaking him until his head snapped back like a ragdoll. Jerry took these stories to the police, to the newspapers, to anyone who would listen. She was told she was disturbed, that she was living in the past, but she wouldn't stop. She eventually reached a young, ambitious detective and a prosecutor who realized that a murder doesn't have an expiration date. In 1987, 22 years after the Easter morning that ended his life, Dennis Jurgens finally got his day in court. The trial was a media sensation, a collision between the old world of private family matters and the new world of child advocacy. Lois Jurgens sat in the courtroom, still rigid, still ironed, her face a cold mask of indignation. She looked like a grandmother, not a killer. But then the witnesses took the stand. They described a house of horrors that sounded more like a medieval dungeon than a suburban home. They described a woman who used her husband as a shield and her child as a punching bag. The jury didn't take long. Lois Jurgens was convicted of third-degree murder. As she was led away in handcuffs, the silence that had protected her for 2 decades was finally, irrevocably broken. Jerry Sherwood stood on the courthouse steps, the Minnesota wind whipping her hair, and for the first time in 26 years, she breathed. She hadn't been able to save her son from the house on Hoffman Road, but she had saved him from being forgotten. Dennis Jurgens' legacy isn't just the tragedy of his death. It's the shift in the soul of the state. Because of him, and because of the mother who wouldn't let him stay buried in silence, Minnesota's mandatory reporting laws were rewritten. The system that once looked the other way was forced to keep its eyes open. Today, the sun still rises over White Bear Lake, and the houses still stand in neat, polite rows, but there is a different kind of watchfulness in the air. We remember that the most dangerous place in the world can sometimes be a quiet home with a closed door, and that justice, however long it takes to arrive, always starts with someone brave enough to ask the first question.